An orphan shared his meal with a beggar, never realizing it was a king in disguise testing his kindness. The boy, 12-year-old Elias, didn't know kings or kingdoms. He knew only the gnawing ache of hunger and the biting winter wind that howled through the cracks of the abandoned storefront he called home. But he knew kindness. Somehow, despite everything, he knew that. The morning had dawned gray and unforgiving over the coastal town of Meridian Bay. Frost crystallized on window panes, and the sea air carried a cutting chill that sliced through threadbare clothing. Elias woke shivering, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the dim light filtering through the newspaper-covered windows. 5 years since the fever had taken his parents. 5 years of surviving on his own. He pushed himself up from his nest of salvaged blankets, wincing as his feet touched the icy floor. His small hands, chapped and reddened, reached for the worn leather satchel that contained his few possessions. A photograph of his parents with faded edges, a small pocket knife, a comb missing several teeth, and a frayed book of fables his mother had read to him in another lifetime. Today was Friday. Fridays meant Mrs. Abernathy would leave day-old bread behind her bakery. She never acknowledged doing it, and Elias never thanked her directly. An unspoken arrangement that preserved his fragile dignity and her appearance of strict business practices. It wasn't charity if nobody called it that. Elias tucked his threadbare scarf around his neck, more ritual than protection against the cold, and slipped through the back door of his makeshift shelter. The alleyways of Meridian Bay were a labyrinth he navigated with practiced ease, avoiding the places where authorities might question a solitary child. He'd learned early that to be seen was to risk being taken away, placed in a system that frightened him more than hunger ever could. The bakery's back door was closed, but as expected, a small paper bag waited beside the trash bins, carefully placed on a wooden crate to keep it clean. Elias approached cautiously, glancing around before darting forward to claim his prize. The bag contained 2 rolls and a slightly squashed pastry. His stomach tightened painfully at the sight. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. "Thank you," he whispered to the closed door, a habit he couldn't break despite the absence of anyone to hear it. He tucked the food carefully into his satchel, saving it for midday when the hunger would become unbearable. First, he had other stops on his survival route, checking the fountain in the town square for dropped coins, visiting the fish market as they closed to collect discarded trimmings he could cook, and scanning the beach for anything of value washed ashore. The town was beginning to wake as Elias made his way toward the square. Shopkeepers raised their shutters, deliverymen unloaded goods, and early risers hurried to work. No one paid much attention to the small, thin boy who kept to the edges of activity, shoulders hunched against both cold and notice. The fountain yielded 3 pennies and a dime, enough for nothing substantial, but Elias pocketed them anyway. The weight of coins was a small comfort, a tiny buffer between himself and complete destitution. Next was the fish market, where the morning's catch was being arranged in gleaming, silvery displays. He waited patiently, watching from behind a stack of crates as the market busied itself with the morning rush. The fishmonger's hands moved deftly, scaling, gutting, filleting. Scraps accumulated in buckets, heads, tails, bones with bits of flesh still clinging to them. Not enough for the market to sell, but more than enough for a boy who knew how to make soup from almost nothing. "Still haunting my market, little ghost?" The voice startled him, though it shouldn't have. Marco, the oldest fishmonger, always spotted him eventually. The grizzled man's weathered face creased into what might have been a scowl or a smile. With Marco, it was hard to tell the difference. Elias stayed silent, poised to run if necessary. "Come on, then." Marco sighed, gesturing with a knife nearly as long as Elias's arm. "I haven't got all day to watch you lurking." Cautiously, Elias approached the stall. Marco thrust a paper-wrapped package at him. "Mackerel trimmings and some cod that's too small to sell." "Don't say I never did nothing for you." "Thank you, sir," Elias murmured, accepting the package with careful hands. "And take this too." Marco pressed an apple into his free hand. "You're getting too skinny, even for a ghost." The unexpected kindness lodged in Elias's throat, making speech impossible. He nodded instead, backing away before emotion could betray him. Kindness was dangerous. It softened the hard edges he needed to survive. By midday, Elias had collected enough for several meals. The bread and pastry, the fish scraps, the apple, and some slightly wilted vegetables gleaned from behind the grocers. He made his way to his special place, a sheltered outcropping of rocks on the less populated north end of the beach. There, hidden from view, he could safely cook his findings over a small fire without attracting attention. The sea stretched endlessly before him, iron gray beneath the winter sky. Waves crashed against the shore with hypnotic rhythm. Sometimes Elias imagined the sea was speaking to him, telling stories of distant lands and different lives. His mother had said the ocean connected all people, that on the other side were children just like him, watching the same water. He wondered if those children were alone too. With practiced efficiency, Elias gathered driftwood and built a small fire in the shelter of the rocks. From his satchel, he produced a small pot, dented but serviceable, that he'd found in a dumpster months ago. He filled it with seawater, added the fish trimmings and vegetables, and balanced it carefully over the flames. While his soup simmered, Elias allowed himself one of Mrs. Abernathy's rolls. He tore it carefully in half, saving the remainder for dinner. The bread was slightly stale but still good, filling his mouth with a yeasty comfort that momentarily quieted the constant ache in his stomach. The soup needed time to cook, so Elias occupied himself by combing the immediate shoreline for treasures. Sea glass worn smooth by the tides, interesting shells, or anything that might have value to the curio shop owner who occasionally bought such findings from him. The search kept his mind from dwelling on his hunger and the cold that had settled deep in his bones, a constant companion since autumn had given way to winter. He was examining a particularly promising piece of sea glass when movement caught his eye. An old man was making his way slowly along the beach, his gait unsteady on the shifting sand. His clothes were ragged and dirty, his beard wild and unkempt. A beggar, Elias realized, probably heading for the more populated areas of town where the possibility of charity was greater. Something about the man's faltering steps and the way he braced himself against the wind stirred a memory in Elias. His father, in the final days of the fever, struggling to cross a room. The recollection sent a sharp pain through his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. Before he could think better of it, Elias raised his hand in greeting. The old man paused, looking around as if uncertain he was the intended recipient of the gesture. Seeing no one else, he changed direction, making his laborious way toward Elias's outcropping. Panic immediately replaced compassion. Elias had drawn attention to himself, to his fire, to his food. Stupid, dangerous. He considered fleeing, but something, perhaps the same instinct that had prompted his greeting, kept him rooted in place. The old man's approach seemed to take forever. Up close, Elias could see that his face was deeply lined, his eyes rheumy and tired. Despite his appearance, there was something in the way he held himself that seemed at odds with his ragged clothing, a straightness to his shoulders that fatigue couldn't quite erase. "Good day to you, young sir," the man said, his voice surprisingly clear and cultured for someone in such apparent distress. "I hope I'm not intruding on your solitude." Elias shook his head, words temporarily abandoning him. The stranger's manner of speech reminded him of the characters in his book of fables. Formal, almost courtly. "Something smells quite wonderful," the man continued, glancing at the small pot bubbling over the fire. "You're quite resourceful to be cooking out here." "It's just soup." Elias found his voice at last. "Fish scraps and some old vegetables." The old man nodded appreciatively. Often the simplest meals are the most satisfying, especially on a cold day such as this. A powerful gust of wind swept across the beach, causing the man to stagger slightly. Without conscious decision, Elias found himself reaching out to steady him, then guiding him to sit on one of the flatter rocks near the fire. "Thank you, my boy." The old man's hands, Elias noticed, were not those of a beggar. Though weathered, they were clean, with neatly trimmed nails and none of the ingrained dirt that marked those who lived on the streets. "Curious. Are you hungry?" The question escaped Elias's lips before he could reconsider it. Part of him, the part that had learned harsh survival lessons, screamed in protest. The food was his, barely enough for himself, certainly not to be shared with strangers. But another part, a part he thought had been silenced by years of hardship, spoke louder. This man was alone in the cold, just as Elias was. And hadn't Marco shown him kindness just hours ago? Hadn't Mrs. Abernathy? The old man hesitated, seeming to sense Elias's internal conflict. "I wouldn't wish to take food from a child," he said softly. "I have enough," Elias lied, reaching for the remaining half of his bread roll and offering it to the stranger. "And the soup will be ready soon." There's plenty." The man accepted the bread with a nod of thanks. "You're very kind." Kindness is rare in this world, especially from those who have little to spare. Elias busied himself with the soup to avoid responding, suddenly embarrassed. He wasn't kind, he was surviving. If he shared now, perhaps the universe would continue to provide for him as it had today. A practical exchange, nothing more. But as he watched the old man savor the half roll, eating it in small, careful bites as if to make it last, something warm unfurled in Elias's chest. a feeling so long absent he almost didn't recognize it. Pride. Not the false pride that made him avoid official charity, but something deeper and truer. For the first time in years, he felt like more than just a survivor. He felt briefly like the boy his parents had raised him to be. When the soup was ready, Elias poured a generous portion into a chipped mug he kept with his cooking pot, offering it to the stranger first. The man accepted it with a grace that seemed to transform the simple act into something ceremonial. To shared meals and unexpected companionship, the old man said, raising the mug slightly before taking a careful sip. Excellent. You have a talent, young Elias, he supplied, serving himself a smaller portion in the pot's lid. Elias, the man repeated as if testing the name. A noble name. I am. He paused almost imperceptibly. You may call me Thomas. They ate in companionable silence, the wind's howl softening as if in deference to their meal. Elias found himself sneaking glances at his unusual guest. Despite his ragged appearance, Thomas ate with impeccable manners, his posture remaining straight even while seated on the uncomfortable rock. May I ask, Elias? Thomas said eventually, why a boy your age is preparing his midday meal alone on a beach rather than at home or at school? The question wasn't accusatory, merely curious, but Elias tensed nonetheless. Questions led to authorities. Authorities led to the system. The system led to unknown terrors. I like it here, he answered vaguely. The sea, the privacy. Thomas nodded, his eyes a striking blue that seemed too vibrant for his aged face, studying Elias with unsettling intensity. The sea has always been a refuge for independent souls, but it's a hard companion in winter. I manage. Yes, Thomas agreed. I can see that you do, quite admirably. Something in his tone made Elias look up sharply. There was respect there, not pity. The distinction mattered more than it should have. Do you have family in town? Elias asked, deflecting attention from himself. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. Family is complicated for me. I have people who depend on me, certainly. But true family? Those who see me for myself rather than what I represent. He shook his head. Those are few and precious. The words resonated with Elias in a way he couldn't articulate. Before his parents died, he had been simply Elias, their son. Afterward, he became the orphan, the street child, the poor thing, defined by his loss rather than his self. I understand, he said quietly. Thomas's gaze softened. Yes, I rather think you do. They finished their meal as the weak winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. Elias felt a peculiar reluctance to end the encounter, though his practical mind told him to pack up and return to his shelter before darkness made the town more dangerous. As if reading his thoughts, Thomas rose stiffly to his feet. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, young Elias. Thank you for the meal and the company. Both were most welcome. You're going back to town? Elias asked, dousing his fire carefully with sand. Yes, I have. Arrangements to make. Something in Thomas's voice had changed, becoming more formal, more distant. Elias nodded, packing his meager cooking implements into his satchel. The path along the cliffs is quicker than the beach, he offered, and more sheltered from the wind. Would you show me? These old legs aren't what they once were, and I fear I've lost my bearings somewhat. The request seemed genuine enough, though something about it nagged at Elias. Thomas didn't move like someone truly infirm, despite his apparent age. Still, the path was tricky in places, especially for a stranger to the area. I can take you as far as the town limits, Elias agreed, slinging his satchel across his body. But then I have things to do. Thomas inclined his head. Of course, I wouldn't wish to interfere with your obligations. They set off together along the narrow cliff path, Elias instinctively slowing his pace to accommodate his companion. The wind had less purchase here, blocked by the rising land to their right. To their left, the sea churned far below, waves crashing against the base of the cliffs in eternal assault. You navigate this path with confidence, Thomas observed after they had walked in silence for several minutes. You must know these shores well, Elias shrugged. I've lived in Meridian Bay all my life. With your parents? The direct question caught Elias off guard. He nearly stumbled, catching himself quickly. They died 5 years ago. I'm sorry, Thomas said. And unlike when adults usually said those words, he didn't follow with platitudes or awkward questions. Instead, he added, loss changes us in ways nothing else can. It makes us who we are, for better or worse. I guess, Elias mumbled, uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. Thomas seemed to sense his discomfort. Forgive an old man's melancholy. The sea makes me philosophical. They continued in silence until the path widened. joining a more established trail that led toward the town. In the distance, Meridian Bay's buildings were visible, smoke rising from chimneys against the darkening sky. The sight usually filled Elias with a complex mixture of longing and wariness. The town was both haven and threat, a place of resources and risks. "This is where I leave you," Elias said, stopping at a point where the path forked. "Town's straight ahead, can't miss it." Thomas paused, studying him with those unnervingly bright eyes. "You won't come into town?" "Like I said, I have things to do." Elias shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "Of course." Thomas reached into his tattered coat and, to Elias's surprise, produced a small pouch. "Please take this as thanks for your kindness today." Elias instinctively stepped back. "I don't need payment for sharing food." "Not payment," Thomas corrected gently. "A gift, freely given in return for a gift freely received. There's a difference." Still, Elias hesitated. Taking things from strangers violated every survival rule he'd established for himself. Thomas seemed to read his thoughts. "At the very least, take this." He withdrew something small from the pouch, a coin that caught the fading light with a golden gleam. "For emergencies. Everyone should have something set aside for desperate times." The practical part of Elias's mind calculated quickly. A gold coin, if genuine, could buy food for weeks, maybe medicine if he fell ill, perhaps even proper winter boots to replace his disintegrating shoes. Still, suspicion warred with need. Why would you give me that?" "You don't know me." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Let's say I recognize something in you that I value highly. Something increasingly rare in this world." Before Elias could question further, Thomas pressed the coin into his palm, closing the boy's fingers around it with surprising strength. "Use it wisely, Elias. And remember that kindness even, perhaps especially from those who have little to give, has immeasurable worth." With that cryptic statement, Thomas inclined his head in a gesture that seemed oddly formal, almost like a bow, then turned and continued down the path toward town. His gait, Elias noticed with confusion, seemed steadier now, his stooped posture somewhat straightened. Elias stood watching until the strange old man disappeared around a bend in the path. Only then did he open his hand to examine the coin. It was heavier than he expected, its surface etched with the profile of a crowned figure he didn't recognize. Foreign currency perhaps, but undeniably gold. Real wealth, more than he'd held in his entire life. A mixture of emotions swirled through him: suspicion, gratitude, confusion, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth. He'd helped someone today, shared what little he had, and somehow ended up with more than when he started. It didn't make sense. Nothing in his 5 years of harsh survival had prepared him for this outcome. Carefully, Elias tucked the coin into the hidden inner pocket of his jacket, the one where he kept his parents' photograph. Then, with a last glance toward town, he turned and headed back along the cliff path. Questions could wait. Night was falling, and he needed to secure his shelter before the temperature dropped further. But as he walked, Elias felt something shift inside him, a tiny flame of possibility where before there had been only the cold certainty of day-to-day survival. One meal shared, one act of kindness to a stranger, and suddenly the world seemed less relentlessly hostile. It was a dangerous feeling, Hope. Dangerous, but, like the weight of the gold coin against his chest, not entirely unwelcome. The following morning dawned even colder than the previous one. Elias woke to find frost patterns decorating the inside of his shelter's windows, delicate crystalline ferns that spoke of temperatures well below freezing. His breath hung visible in the air, and the thin blankets he'd pulled over himself during the night did little to ward off the penetrating chill. His first conscious thought was of the gold coin. His hand moved instinctively to the inner pocket where he'd secured it, relief washing through him when his fingers confirmed its presence. It hadn't been a dream then. The strange encounter, the shared meal, the unexpected gift, all real. The second thought was more troubling. Today was Saturday. Saturday meant no bread from Mrs. Abernathy, whose bakery remained closed for the weekend. It meant fewer people at the market, fewer scraps, fewer opportunities to glean what he needed. Saturdays had always been lean days, requiring careful rationing of whatever he'd managed to accumulate during the week. But today, Elias realized with a start, could be different. The coin in his pocket represented freedom from hunger, at least temporarily. He could walk into any shop in Meridian Bay and purchase actual food, a whole loaf of fresh bread, perhaps even meat or cheese. The thought was so alien, so disorienting, that for a moment he remained motionless on his makeshift bed, mind racing with possibilities. Reality quickly tempered his excitement. A child alone, clearly poor, attempting to pay with a gold coin would attract exactly the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. Questions would be asked. Authorities might be called. The coin would be confiscated as surely stolen. Because what other explanation could there be for someone like him possessing such wealth? No, Elias decided reluctantly. The coin was emergency savings, just as Thomas had suggested. Not for trivial comforts like a full stomach or warm clothes, but for true dire need. Serious illness or injury perhaps, or if his shelter was discovered and he needed to travel elsewhere. With that resolution made, Elias forced himself from the relative warmth of his blankets and began his morning routine. He splashed his face with water from a plastic jug he kept filled, ran his broken comb through his tangled hair, and inventoried his food supplies. The remaining pastry from yesterday would be breakfast. For the rest of the day, he had half a fish head and some vegetable scraps. Meager, but he'd survived on less. As he chewed the stale pastry, savoring each bite to make it last, Elias found his thoughts returning to Thomas. There had been something odd about the old man, something that didn't quite align with his appearance as a beggar. His speech, his manners, the way he'd carried himself, all suggested someone of education and position, not a person reduced to wandering beaches in winter. And that coin, Elias removed it from his pocket again, studying it in the weak morning light filtering through the frosted windows. The profile on its face was of an older man with a strong jaw and stern expression, the crown upon his head ornate and detailed despite the coin's small size. Around the edge ran an inscription in letters Elias couldn't read. Not English, certainly, but something with similar characters. A foreign visitor, perhaps? Someone who had fallen on hard times while traveling? But that didn't explain the coin, which was clearly valuable. A confused old man who didn't understand what he was giving away? That didn't match the sharp intelligence in those blue eyes. Elias shook his head, tucking the coin away again. The mystery of Thomas and his gift would have to wait. Saturday's challenges demanded his full attention. He wrapped his scarf around his neck, pulled his thin jacket tightly closed, and ventured out into the biting cold. The town was quieter than usual, many residents choosing to remain in their warm homes rather than brave the frigid temperatures. Those who were out moved quickly, heads down against the wind, breath clouding around their hurried faces. Elias made his usual rounds, but as he'd anticipated, pickings were slim. The fish market was half empty, with fewer vendors and customers. Marco wasn't working today, and the other fishmongers were less generous with their scraps. The fountain in the town square yielded nothing, too cold for people to linger and accidentally drop coins. Even the beach offered little, the tide having carried away anything of value during the night. By midday, hunger gnawed at him with familiar persistence. The half pastry he'd eaten that morning was a distant memory, and the thought of returning to his cold shelter with only the meager findings in his satchel was particularly depressing after yesterday's relative bounty. Elias found himself wandering closer to the center of town than he usually dared, drawn by the distant sounds of activity. A collection of colorful stalls had been erected in the main square, some kind of weekend market or fair. People clustered around them despite the cold, examining wares, talking, laughing. The scent of food wafted on the air, hot, savory smells that made Elias's stomach clench painfully. Keeping to the shadows between buildings, Elias observed the scene with cautious interest. Such gatherings sometimes provided opportunities. Dropped items, discarded food, momentarily unattended belongings. Not that he stole exactly, he salvaged. There was a difference, though the distinction sometimes blurred when hunger became too sharp. As he watched, a commotion near the far end of the square caught his attention. A crowd was gathering, their excited murmurs carrying even to Elias's position. Curiosity overcame caution, and he edged closer, staying within the shelter of an alleyway, while straining to see what had caused the stir. Royal Guards. The realization hit Elias with a jolt of alarm. Their distinctive uniforms, deep blue with silver trim, were unmistakable, though he'd only seen them once before, during a ceremonial visit from the king 3 years ago. Now a group of them stood at attention, forming a pathway through the crowd toward one of the larger market stalls. Elias's first instinct was to retreat. Guards meant authority, authority meant questions, questions meant danger. But something kept him rooted in place, a strange, prickling sensation at the back of his neck, a feeling of something important about to happen. The crowd's murmurs swelled into excited exclamations as a new figure appeared, flanked by additional guards. Even from a distance, the newcomer's identity was obvious. The crown, the ceremonial sash of royal blue and silver, the formal bearing, King Alaric, monarch of Westerland, had come to Meridian Bay's humble weekend market. Elias had seen the king only in glimpses during that visit years ago, a distant figure on a balcony waving to assembled citizens. Now, though still too far for details, he could make out more. A tall man with broad shoulders, walking with confident strides through the path his guards had created. The crowd bowed or curtsied as he passed, many reaching out as if the mere touch of his shadow might bring good fortune. Strange that the king would visit their small coastal town with so little ceremony. During the previous royal visit, the entire town had been decorated for weeks in advance, streets cleaned, buildings repainted. This appearance seemed almost spontaneous. Elias was so absorbed in watching the royal procession that he failed to notice the two boys approaching until they were nearly upon him. Older boys, 15 or 16 perhaps, with the well-fed look of those who'd never missed a meal. "What are you staring at, gutter rat?" The taller of the two gave Elias a shove that sent him stumbling back against the alley wall. "Planning to pick some pockets while everyone's distracted?" "I wasn't," Elias began, but the second boy cut him off with a sneer. "Save it. Everyone knows what you are. Town be better off if they shipped you to an orphanage where you belong." Elias had learned long ago that arguing only prolonged such encounters. He tried to edge sideways, seeking an escape route, but the boys blocked his path. Fear flickered in his chest, not just of the immediate threat, but of the attention they might attract. Guards were present, officials, people who could make decisions about unaccompanied minors. "What's this?" The taller boy had noticed the slight bulge in Elias's jacket where the coin pressed against the fabric. "Got something worth taking for once?" A hand shot out, grabbing the front of Elias's jacket. He reacted instinctively, twisting away with the desperate quickness that had saved him from similar situations before. But the boy's grip was strong, fabric tearing as Elias pulled free. The sound of ripping cloth was followed by a metallic ping as the gold coin, dislodged from its hiding place, fell to the cobblestones. For one frozen moment, all three boys stared at the gleaming disc. Then, with synchronized movement born of predatory instinct, the older boys lunged for it. "No!" Elias cried, diving forward. His fingers closed around the coin a heartbeat before the others could reach it. Relief surged through him, short-lived and immediately replaced by pain as a boot connected with his ribs. "Give it here, rat!" The taller boy's face had transformed with greed. "That's stolen, and you know it! It's mine!" Elias gasped, curling around the coin clutched in his fist. It was a gift. The boys laughed, the sound ugly and disbelieving. "A gift? To you? From who? The fairy godmother?" Another kick, this one catching Elias in the shoulder. "Hand it over before we really hurt you." Panic gave Elias strength. He scrambled to his feet and bolted deeper into the alley, away from the market square and the watching crowd. Behind him, he heard the pounding of pursuing footsteps and angry shouts. He was smaller and quicker, but the older boys had longer legs and the advantage of regular meals. The narrow gap was closing. The alley ended in a T-junction. Left would take him toward the docks, right toward the residential area. Both directions meant open streets, visibility, nowhere to hide. Desperation made the decision for him. Elias veered left toward the docks and the sea beyond. If he could reach the jumble of crates and fishing equipment that littered the wharf, he might find a hiding place small enough for him, but too tight for his pursuers. But the choice proved disastrous. As he rounded the corner, Elias found himself facing a solid wall of blue and silver. Royal guards positioned at the alley's exit, apparently securing the perimeter around the king's visit. They turned at the sound of running feet, hands moving instinctively to the ceremonial swords at their sides. Elias skidded to a halt, terror freezing his blood. Behind him, the footsteps of his pursuers slowed as they too registered the new obstacle. For an excruciating moment, Elias stood trapped between two threats, his mind blank with panic. "What's happening here?" One of the guards stepped forward, his stern gaze moving from Elias to the older boys and back again. "Why are you running?" "He stole something, sir," the taller boy called out, quick to establish a narrative. "We saw him picking pockets in the square and chased him." "That's not true!" Elias found his voice, though it emerged higher and shakier than he intended. "They attacked me. They tried to take what's mine." The guard's expression remained impassive. "Empty your pockets, boy." The command left no room for argument. With trembling hands, Elias reached into his pocket and withdrew the gold coin, holding it up for inspection. The guard's eyes widened slightly, the only break in his professional demeanor. "Bueno, where did you get that?" The question was sharp, suspicious. "It was a gift," Elias repeated, the explanation sounding hollow even to his own ears. From an old man I met yesterday. I shared my food with him, and he gave me this to thank me. Behind him, the older boy snickered at the obvious lie. Even the guard's expression suggested disbelief, though he maintained his official tone. That coin bears the royal seal of Westerland. It's not the sort of thing given away to children, especially by old men on beaches. The guard held out his hand. I'll need to confiscate this while we determine its rightful owner. Despair washed over Elias in a cold wave. His one chance at security, his emergency salvation, about to be taken away. Without conscious thought, his fingers closed tightly around the coin, pulling it back toward his chest. Please, he whispered, it's all I have. Something in his voice, the raw honesty perhaps, or the quiet dignity in his plea, caused the guard to hesitate. In that moment of uncertainty, a new voice entered the confrontation, deep and commanding. What seems to be the problem, Captain? The guards immediately straightened to attention, faces forward, shoulders back. From behind their rigid forms emerged a tall figure whose identity struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. The King of Westerland stood before him, no longer a distant figure glimpsed across a crowded square, but a flesh and blood man close enough to touch. In his late 50s perhaps, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through Elias's shabby exterior to something hidden beneath. Blue eyes. Familiar blue eyes. Recognition dawned with breathtaking suddenness. The beggar from the beach. Thomas, not a beggar at all, but King Alaric himself in disguise. The realization was so overwhelming that Elias swayed slightly where he stood, lightheaded with shock. Your Majesty, the guard began, bowing deeply. We encountered these boys in pursuit of this one. He gestured toward Elias. He possesses what appears to be a royal gold ducat, origin suspicious. The king's gaze never left Elias's face. Is that so? Elias couldn't speak. His mind raced with implications, with questions, with the enormity of what had happened yesterday on that windswept beach. He had shared his meager soup with the king, had spoken casually to him, guided him along the cliff path, had received a royal gold coin without recognizing its significance. King Alaric stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Let me see the coin, boy. With numb fingers, Elias uncurled his fist, revealing the gold piece resting in his palm. The king glanced at it briefly, then to everyone's surprise smiled. A warm, genuine expression that transformed his regal features into something almost avuncular. Ah, yes, he said, his voice carrying easily to the assembled guards and the two older boys who now stood frozen in confusion. I recognize this particular ducat. It has a small nick on the edge, just there. He pointed to a barely perceptible imperfection. I gave it yesterday to a young man who showed exceptional kindness to a stranger in need. The guard's professional composure cracked visibly. Your Majesty, this boy, the king continued, placing a firm hand on Elias's shoulder, shared his meal with a beggar he encountered on the beach. He had very little himself, fish scraps and stale bread, hardly a feast, yet he offered half without hesitation. He even guided the old man safely back toward town, ensuring he wouldn't lose his way. The king's eyes, those startling blue eyes that had seemed out of place in a beggar's weathered face, crinkled slightly at the corners. He asked for nothing in return, expected nothing. Such selflessness deserves recognition. Wouldn't you agree, Captain? Of course, Your Majesty. The guard responded automatically, though confusion still clouded his features. The king turned his attention to the two older boys, who had shrunk back against the alley wall, their earlier aggression replaced by evident terror at finding themselves under royal scrutiny. And you two, the king addressed them, his tone hardening perceptibly. You pursued this boy with intent to steal what was rightfully his, did you not? We thought, the taller boy began, voice cracking. We assumed he'd stolen it, Your Majesty. Ah, you assumed. The king nodded thoughtfully. And that assumption gave you the right to assault someone smaller and weaker? To take justice into your own hands? The boys stared at the ground, faces flushed with shame. Your names? The king demanded. When they mumbled their responses, he continued, I shall be speaking with your parents before I leave Meridian Bay. Perhaps they can explain why their son's belief might makes right. The threat hung in the air, potent and unavoidable. The boys seemed to shrink further into themselves, nodding miserably at the cobblestones. With a dismissive gesture, King Alaric turned back to Elias, his expression softening once more. As for you, young man, Elias, isn't it? I believe we have matters to discuss. Would you accompany me? It wasn't truly a request, despite its phrasing. The king's hand remained on Elias's shoulder, gentle but firm, guiding him past the bewildered guards and toward the market square beyond. Elias went without resistance, still too stunned by the turn of events to form coherent thoughts, let alone objections. The crowd parted before them, faces registering surprise and curiosity at the sight of their monarch walking alongside a ragged street child. Whispers followed in their wake, quickly spreading the improbable tale. The king himself had intervened on behalf of the orphan boy, had claimed personal knowledge of him, had shown him favor. Elias was acutely aware of his shabby appearance beside the king's regal splendor. His torn jacket, his dirty hands, his too-thin frame, all thrown into sharp relief by proximity to such elevated company. Shame heated his cheeks, yet the king's hand remained steadily on his shoulder, neither drawing away from his poverty nor seeming to notice it. They approached a large pavilion at the center of the square, its canvas sides drawn against the cold royal pennants fluttering from its peaks. Guards posted at its entrance snapped to attention, pulling aside the heavy fabric to allow the king and his unlikely companion to enter. Inside, warmth enveloped them immediately, a blessed relief from the winter chill. Braziers placed strategically throughout the space radiated heat, taking the sting from Elias's frozen fingers and bringing painful life back to his numb toes. The pavilion was simply but elegantly furnished with several chairs, a table laden with food and drink, and a small writing desk. "Please, sit." The king gestured to one of the chairs. When Elias hesitated, he added with a hint of amusement, "It's not a request this time, but a command. You look ready to collapse, and I'd rather not have to explain to my guards why I've caused a child to faint." Obediently, Elias perched on the edge of the indicated chair, his back straight, hands clasped tightly in his lap. The king took the seat opposite, studying him with those penetrating blue eyes that missed nothing. "You're wondering why," King Alaric said after a moment. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded, finding his voice at last. "Yes, your majesty. Why I disguised myself as a beggar. Why I was on that beach. Why I gave you the coin. Or perhaps, most pressingly, why I've brought you here now." The king smiled faintly. "All reasonable questions. All of them," Elias admitted. King Alaric leaned back in his chair, his formal posture relaxing slightly. "I make a habit, Elias, of traveling incognito through my kingdom at regular intervals. My advisors disapprove, my security detail despairs, but I find it necessary. When one wears a crown, one sees a carefully curated version of the world. People show their best faces, hide their troubles, present what they think a king wishes to see." He gestured dismissively. "It becomes a beautiful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless." Elias listened, captivated despite his lingering shock and confusion. "So I disguise myself," the king continued. "I become a merchant, a traveler, a beggar, whatever role allows me to see my kingdom and its people as they truly are. Yesterday, I wished to understand how the coastal communities were faring after the autumn storms. The official reports were satisfactory, but you wanted to see for yourself," Elias finished quietly. The king nodded, seeming pleased by the understanding. "Exactly so. I wanted to see not just repaired buildings and functioning markets, but the spirit of the people, their kindness or cruelty to strangers, their resilience in the face of hardship." His gaze sharpened. "What I did not expect to find was a child living alone on the margins of society, surviving through remarkable resourcefulness, yet still possessing the generosity to share his meager provisions with someone he perceived as less fortunate than himself." Heat crept up Elias's neck at the praise. "It was just soup," he mumbled, echoing his words from the day before. "It was more than that," the king corrected gently. "It was a choice. You chose kindness when hardship might have taught you selfishness. You chose compassion when experience might have counseled suspicion." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "Tell me, Elias, how long have you been living on your own?" The directness of the question made evasion impossible. 5 years, your majesty. Since I was 7. Something flashed in the king's eyes. Anger, perhaps, though not directed at Elias. "And no one in authority noticed? No one intervened?" Elias shrugged, uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. "I stay out of sight. It's safer that way." "Safer than what?" "Than being sent away. To an orphanage or..." He trailed off, unable to articulate the nameless fears that had kept him hiding for so long. Understanding softened the king's expression. "You feared losing what little control you had over your own life." It was precisely that. Though Elias had never put it into words before, he nodded, relieved at being understood without having to explain. "A reasonable fear," the king acknowledged. "But a life of constant hunger and cold is a heavy price to pay for independence." "It's not so bad," Elias said automatically, the defensive response worn smooth with repetition. "I manage." "Yes, you do. Admirably so." King Alaric's tone shifted, becoming more formal. However, I find myself in your debt, Elias of Meridian Bay. In my... Elias blinked in confusion. But you're the king. His smile touched the monarch's lips. Kings can incur debts of honor as readily as any man, perhaps more so as our actions carry greater weight. He rose from his chair and moved to the table laden with food, selecting a plate and beginning to fill it. You shared your meal with me yesterday. Allow me to return the courtesy today. Before Elias could protest, the king had placed before him a plate piled high with sliced meats, cheese, fresh bread, and winter fruits. The sight and smell made his stomach clench painfully, saliva flooding his mouth in Pavlovian response. Please eat, the king urged, taking his seat once more. We can continue our discussion once you've had your fill. Permission granted, Elias reached for the food with as much restraint as he could muster. The first bite of fresh bread, still warm, spread with creamy butter, nearly brought tears to his eyes. He forced himself to eat slowly, to savor each mouthful, though every instinct screamed at him to devour everything before it could be taken away. The king watched him with an expression that mingled satisfaction and something deeper, more complicated, a sadness perhaps, or regret. When Elias had eaten enough to take the edge from his hunger, King Alaric spoke again. I have a proposition for you, Elias. One I hope you will consider carefully. Wareness immediately replaced Elias's momentary contentment. Propositions from adults, in his experience, rarely favored children like him. Noting his expression, the king raised a hand. Hear me out before you decide. I'm not offering charity, but an opportunity, one you've earned through your actions. Somewhat mollified, Elias nodded for him to continue. The royal household includes an academy for promising young people. King Alaric explained. Some are children of nobility or court officials, but others come from more diverse backgrounds. Students receive education, training in various disciplines, and preparation for service to the crown in whatever capacity best suits their talents. Elias listened with growing disbelief. Surely the king wasn't suggesting, I would like to offer you a place in this academy? King Alaric confirmed, as if reading his thoughts. You would have safe lodging, regular meals, education, and eventually a position of respect and purpose. In return, you would pledge your loyalty and service to Westerland when your training is complete. The offer was so far beyond anything Elias had imagined for his future that he couldn't immediately process it. Education, safety, regular meals, a future that didn't involve scavenging and hiding. It seemed impossible, a fairy tale ending dropped into his harsh reality. Why me? He asked finally, the only question that seemed to matter. Because I gave you soup? The king's laugh was unexpected. A warm, genuine sound that momentarily replaced the regal figure with the more approachable Thomas from the beach. In part, yes. That soup, fish scraps and old vegetables, as I recall, revealed more about your character than you realize. His expression grew serious again. I look for certain qualities in potential academy students. Resilience, resourcefulness, integrity, compassion. You've demonstrated all these in abundance, both in how you've survived these past 5 years and in how you treated a stranger in need. Put that way, it almost made sense. Almost. But I don't know anything about courts or being proper, or neither did many of our most successful graduates when they arrived. The king interrupted gently. The academy teaches more than just academic subjects, Elias. It provides all the tools one needs to navigate any environment, including a royal court. He paused, studying the boy's face. But perhaps most importantly, it offers community, a place to belong. The word struck something deep within Elias, a longing so fundamental he'd buried it beneath layers of practiced independence. Belonging, family, home, concepts that had become abstract memories rather than living possibilities. I would understand if you need time to consider, the king continued. It's a significant change from the life you've known. Elias looked down at his half-eaten meal, at the warmth of the pavilion, at the respectful distance the guards maintained, treating him not as a street urchin to be chased away, but as a guest of their monarch. Then he thought of his cold shelter, the daily struggle for food, the loneliness that was his constant companion. I don't need time, he said quietly, raising his eyes to meet the king's gaze. I accept. Thank you, your majesty. Something like satisfaction settled on King Alaric's features. Excellent. We'll make arrangements immediately for your journey to the capital. He rose from his chair, signaling the conversation's end. Is there anything you wish to collect from your current residence before we depart? The question gave Elias pause. His few possessions, The photograph of his parents, his book of fables, the pocket knife his father had given him. Small things, insignificant to anyone else, but containing the last threads of who he had been before becoming simply the orphan. "Yes," he answered. "If that's permitted?" "Of course." The king nodded to one of his guards. "Captain Brennan will accompany you. Take whatever time you need, but understand that we must depart for the capital before nightfall." The reality of what was happening began to sink in. By sunset, Elias would leave Meridian Bay, the only home he'd ever known, for an uncertain future in a distant city. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. "One more thing, Elias," the king said as the boy rose to follow the designated guard. "The coin I gave you, keep it. Not as payment, but as a reminder of our unusual first meeting and the changes it has brought to both our lives." Elias's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, where the gold piece rested safely once more. "I will, Your Majesty. Thank you." As he followed Captain Brennan from the pavilion, back into the winter chill and the curious stares of the townspeople, Elias felt the weight of the coin against his chest, heavier now with meaning than with mere gold. One meal shared with a stranger, one act of kindness given without expectation of return, and somehow, against all odds, it had changed everything. The guard kept a respectful distance as Elias led the way through Meridian Bay's winding streets toward his hidden shelter. No longer needing to skulk in shadows or take circuitous routes to avoid notice, Elias walked openly beside the uniformed man, aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. The townspeople's curiosity was palpable. What connection could possibly exist between the ragged orphan boy and a royal guard? When they reached the abandoned storefront that had been his home for the past 3 years, Elias hesitated, suddenly embarrassed by its dilapidated condition. Captain Brennan, however, maintained his professional demeanor, showing neither pity nor disgust as he followed Elias through the concealed rear entrance. Inside, the space was exactly as Elias had left it that morning. His nest of blankets in one corner, a small shelf fashioned from scavenged wood holding his few possessions, a collection of containers for water and food storage. It was clean and orderly, evidence of the pride he'd taken in creating something that was exclusively his own. "I won't be long," Elias murmured, moving to the shelf. The guard nodded, remaining by the entrance. "Take your time." Elias collected his treasures with careful hands. The photograph of his parents, the book of fables with its tattered cover, the pocket knife with his father's initials carved into the handle. He added his comb, though it was barely functional, and a small wooden carving of a boat his father had made for him on his 7th birthday. Everything else, the blankets, the makeshift cookware, the containers, he would leave behind. Someone else might find use for them. As he placed the items in his satchel, Elias found himself unexpectedly emotional. This place, for all its hardships, had been his sanctuary. He had survived here, protected himself here, grown from a frightened child into someone capable of independence. Leaving felt like abandoning a part of himself, even as he recognized the opportunity that lay ahead. "Ready?" Captain Brennan asked quietly when Elias finally straightened, satchel slung across his body. "Yes," Elias replied, taking one last look around. "I'm ready." They made their way back through the town, this time heading directly to the harbor where, Elias was startled to learn, the royal ship awaited. Not just any vessel, but a magnificent 3-masted ship with gleaming woodwork and sails emblazoned with the royal crest of Westerland. It dwarfed the fishing boats and trading vessels that typically occupied Meridian Bay's modest port. A small crowd had gathered to witness the royal departure. Among them, Elias spotted familiar faces. Marco the fishmonger, Mrs. Abernathy from the bakery, other townspeople who had unwittingly contributed to his survival over the years. They stared at him with undisguised astonishment as he walked alongside the royal guard toward the waiting ship. At the gangplank, King Alaric himself stood conversing with several officials who appeared to be town leaders. He looked up as Elias approached, his expression warming. "Ah, excellent timing. We're nearly ready to depart." The king turned to the assembled dignitaries. "Gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Elias of Meridian Bay, the newest appointee to the Royal Academy." The officials' faces registered varying degrees of shock as they looked between the king and the ragged boy. Elias felt himself flush under their scrutiny, but straightened his shoulders, determined not to appear as intimidated as he felt. "Your Majesty," one of the men, the mayor, Elias realized, ventured hesitantly. "This boy is, well, he's been living rough for some time. There are proper channels for orphan children, procedures that have evidently failed in this case. The king interrupted, his tone pleasant but allowing no argument. 5 years, Mayor Harlow. This child has survived on his own in your town for 5 years, demonstrating remarkable resilience and character. Rather than questioning his selection for the academy, perhaps consider what his situation reveals about the efficacy of those proper channels you mention. The mayor blanched, mumbling apologies. The other officials studied their boots, equally discomfited by the royal rebuke. King Alaric's hand settled on Elias's shoulder, steering him gently toward the gangplank. Come, the tide waits for no man, not even kings. As they boarded the ship, Elias couldn't help glancing back at the town, the only world he'd known, receding as he stepped into an unknown future. A mixture of emotions swirled within him: trepidation, excitement, disbelief, and underneath it all, a tentative hope. The deck of the royal vessel was a hive of controlled activity, sailors moving with practiced efficiency to prepare for departure. None questioned the presence of the shabby boy accompanying their monarch. If the king had brought him aboard, that was explanation enough. Captain Brennan will show you to your quarters, King Alaric informed him. We'll speak further once we're underway. For now, rest, refresh yourself, become accustomed to your new circumstances. With that, he moved away to consult with the ship's captain, leaving Elias to follow the guard below deck. The interior of the ship was as impressive as its exterior. Polished wood, brass fittings, an unexpected sense of spaciousness, despite being confined within a vessel. The cabin to which Elias was led was small but comfortable, containing a narrow bed, a small desk and chair, a washstand with basin and pitcher, and a porthole that offered a view of the harbor. These are your temporary quarters for the journey, Captain Brennan explained, his manner professional but not unkind. Fresh clothing has been provided. He gestured to a small trunk at the foot of the bed, and water for washing. A steward will bring you a meal shortly and notify you when His Majesty wishes to see you. Elias nodded, momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden shift in his circumstances. Just hours ago, he had been scrounging for scraps in an almost empty market. Now he stood in private quarters aboard a royal ship, with clean clothes and the promise of regular meals. The guard seemed to sense his disorientation. It's a lot to take in, he acknowledged, his formal demeanor softening slightly. But His Majesty has a keen eye for potential. If he's chosen you for the academy, he has his reasons. With a brief nod, he withdrew, closing the door behind him. Alone for the first time since the extraordinary encounter in the alley, Elias sank onto the edge of the bed, his legs suddenly weak. The events of the day seemed dreamlike in their improbability. He half expected to wake at any moment, cold and hungry in his makeshift shelter. The entire experience nothing more than a fantasy born of desperation. But the gentle rocking of the ship beneath him was real. The clean scent of the cabin was real. The trunk of clothing, the washstand with its pitcher of warm water, the soft mattress beneath him, all real. Almost reverently, Elias removed the gold coin from his pocket, turning it over in his palm. The king's profile caught the light from the porthole, the engraved features seeming to shift with the movement. A reminder, the king had called it, a token of their unusual first meeting and the changes it had brought. An orphan shared his meal with a beggar, never realizing it was a king in disguise testing his kindness. The truth of the situation struck Elias anew. He hadn't known who Thomas was, hadn't recognized royalty beneath the ragged disguise, had shared his meager food not for reward or recognition, but simply because it felt right. And somehow that simple act had altered the course of his life completely. The realization was both humbling and empowering. Small kindnesses mattered. Individual choices had consequences beyond their immediate circumstances. Even someone as seemingly insignificant as an orphan street child could affect change through nothing more complicated than basic decency. As the ship's bell rang, signaling imminent departure, Elias moved to the porthole. Meridian Bay stretched before him, familiar and yet suddenly foreign, a chapter of his life closing as a new one began. He pressed his palm against the glass, a silent farewell to the town that had been both his prison and his teacher. The vessel lurched gently as it pulled away from the dock, sails unfurling to catch the afternoon breeze. Elias felt a corresponding shift within himself, a letting go of the past and an opening to possibility. Whatever lay ahead at the Royal Academy, whatever challenges and opportunities awaited in his new life, he would face them with the same resilience and integrity that had sustained him through 5 years of solitary survival. And perhaps, he thought as the gold coin warmed in his palm, with a new understanding of how profoundly a single act of kindness could change not just a life, but an entire future. The journey to the capital took 3 days. 3 days in which Elias's world expanded and transformed in ways he could never have imagined. Each morning he woke in his cabin to the gentle rocking of the ship, momentarily disoriented before remembering the extraordinary turn his life had taken. Each day brought new experiences, new knowledge, new glimpses of the wider world beyond Meridian Bay's limited horizons. King Alaric, despite the demands on his attention, made time daily to speak with Elias, sometimes at length. Their conversations ranged widely, from Elias's life before and after losing his parents, to the governance of Westerland, to the nature of the education he would receive at the Royal Academy. The king, Elias discovered, was both a patient listener and a thoughtful explainer, never dismissing questions or speaking down to him despite the vast gulf in their positions. The academy was my grandmother's initiative, the king told him during one such conversation as they stood at the ship's rail, watching the coastline slide past. She believed that talent and character could be found in all corners of the kingdom, not merely in noble houses. That to strengthen Westerland, we must draw from the full well of our people's capabilities, not just the privileged few. How many students are there? Elias asked, trying to imagine his new environment. Currently 47, ranging in age from 10 to 20, King Alaric replied. Some, like yourself, come from challenging circumstances. Others are children of court officials or minor nobility. All are selected for qualities that suggest potential for meaningful service to the realm. And after the academy? What happens then? The king smiled at the practical question. That depends on your aptitudes and interests. Some graduates enter diplomatic service, others military leadership. Some become scholars, engineers, healers. The path isn't predetermined. It evolves as your education progresses and your strengths become evident. The concept was almost too expansive for Elias to grasp. For 5 years, his entire focus had been day-to-day survival. The idea of a future with options, with paths determined by ability rather than circumstance, seemed like something from his book of fables rather than a reality awaiting him. On the morning of the 4th day, the capital city of Westerland came into view, a sprawling expanse rising from the meeting point of river and sea. Unlike Meridian Bay's modest collection of buildings clustered around a natural harbor, the capital was a planned city, its layout visible even from a distance. Concentric rings of structures surrounded a central hill upon which stood the royal palace, its white stone towers catching the morning light like beacons. Elias watched its approach from the deck, struck speechless by the scale and grandeur. Beside him, Captain Brennan, who had become something of a guide during the journey, pointed out landmarks. The outer ring is primarily commercial, markets, guild halls, businesses. The middle ring houses government buildings, embassies, homes of officials and wealthy merchants. The inner ring contains the royal compound, the palace itself, the government offices, the academy, and residences for the court. The guard glanced at Elias's overwhelmed expression with understanding. It's quite a sight when you first see it. It's enormous. Elias managed trying to comprehend the thousands of lives contained within those rings of stone and timber. As the ship navigated the wide river channel toward the royal docks, the city's activity became visible. Boats of all sizes moving across the water, people thronging the waterfront, carts and carriages traversing the broad avenues that radiated from the central hill like spokes from a wheel. The noise reached them even across the water, a steady hum of commerce and life so different from Meridian Bay's quieter rhythms. Their arrival was met with considerably more ceremony than their departure had been. A delegation awaited at the royal dock, officials in formal dress, a small honor guard, even a group of musicians whose brassy fanfare announced the king's return. Elias, suddenly acutely aware of his new clothing, provided from the ship's stores and hastily altered to approximate his size, hung back as King Alaric disembarked to formal greetings. Captain Brennan, noting his hesitation, gave him a small nudge forward. "Stay close to His Majesty," he advised quietly. "He'll guide you through the formalities." Indeed, after exchanging brief words with the welcoming officials, the king turned and beckoned to Elias, who descended the gangplank on unsteady legs. A ripple of curiosity passed through the assembled dignitaries as the boy approached. A stranger, clearly not of noble birth despite his new attire, yet apparently under royal protection. "Lady Chancellor," King Alaric addressed a tall, silver-haired woman whose formal robes and chain of office marked her high position. "May I present Elias of Meridian Bay, the newest appointee to the Royal Academy." "Elias, this is Lady Chancellor Verity, who oversees matters of state in my absence. The woman's sharp eyes assessed Elias with frank curiosity. A pleasure, young man, she said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. His Majesty sent word of your appointment. The Academy has been notified to expect you. Elias bowed awkwardly, unsure of the proper protocol, but determined not to embarrass himself or the king. Thank you, my lady. A slight smile touched the Chancellor's austere features. Well-mannered, at least. That will serve you well. She turned back to the king. The Privy Council awaits your report on the coastal inspection, your Majesty. At your convenience, of course. Of course, King Alaric echoed with good humor. Though I suspect at my convenience translates to immediately in council terms. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. Captain Brennan will escort Elias to the Academy while I attend to matters of state. Please arrange for Master Teller to receive him and oversee his integration. Already done, your Majesty. Master Teller awaits at the Academy. With efficient formality, the welcome concluded, the official party moving toward waiting carriages. King Alaric drew Elias slightly aside before joining them. This is where our paths diverge temporarily, he said, his voice pitched for Elias's ears alone. Captain Brennan will take you to the Academy, where Master Teller, a good man, though he may not seem so at first, will handle your orientation. I'll check on your progress when duties permit. The king's expression softened slightly. Remember why you're here, Elias. Not charity, not happenstance, but earned opportunity. Carry that knowledge with you in the days ahead. I will, your Majesty. Thank you. The words seemed inadequate for all that had transpired, but they were all Elias had to offer. The king nodded, squeezing his shoulder once, before moving to join the waiting officials. Elias watched him go with a curious mixture of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also a twinge of abandonment, irrational though it was. In the space of a few days, King Alaric had become a fixed point in his rapidly changing world. Now he would face what came next without that steady presence. Come, Captain Brennan said, gesturing toward a smaller, less ornate carriage. The Academy awaits. The journey through the capital was a blur of overwhelming impressions. The press of people, the variety of buildings, the evidence of wealth and activity on a scale Elias had never imagined. The carriage wound its way up broad avenues toward the central hill, passing through gates that marked the transitions between the city's rings. With each passage, the surroundings grew more imposing, the architecture more refined, the people more richly dressed. Finally, they entered the innermost ring, the royal compound, passing elegant buildings of white stone surrounded by carefully tended gardens, now dormant in winter but still meticulously maintained. The carriage turned onto a tree-lined avenue that curved around the base of the hill, eventually stopping before a substantial structure set somewhat apart from its neighbors. The Royal Academy, Captain Brennan announced as a liveried attendant opened the carriage door. The building was impressive without being intimidating. 3 stories of warm golden stone with large windows and a central doorway framed by columns. Above the entrance, carved in stone, was the Academy's motto, knowledge, service, honor. Elias followed Captain Brennan up the wide steps, trying to quell the nervous flutter in his stomach. Through the massive doors lay his future, a life so different from anything he'd known that he could barely conceive of it. Would he adapt? Would he succeed? Or would this grand opportunity reveal him as fundamentally unsuited to anything beyond basic survival? The entrance hall beyond the doors was high-ceilinged and bright, its walls adorned with portraits and maps, its floor tiled in an intricate pattern that drew the eye toward a grand staircase at the far end. Several people moved purposefully through the space, adults in formal academic robes, adolescents in what appeared to be uniforms of dark blue and silver. A few glanced curiously at the new arrivals, but most continued about their business with the focus of those accustomed to their environment. Awaiting them near the entrance was a man whose appearance instantly commanded attention. Tall and lean, with iron gray hair cropped close to his scalp and a precisely trimmed goatee, he wore academic robes of midnight blue with silver accents that matched the uniforms of the students. His posture was military straight, his expression one of contained assessment as he watched their approach. Master Teller, Captain Brennan greeted him with obvious respect. By order of His Majesty King Alaric, I present Elias of Meridian Bay, appointed to the Royal Academy. The man, Master Teller, inclined his head in acknowledgement. Thank you, Captain. I'll take charge of our new arrival from here. Captain Brennan turned to Elias, offering a formal bow that nonetheless conveyed genuine goodwill. Good fortune in your studies, Elias of Meridian Bay. Perhaps our paths will cross again. With that, the guard departed, leaving Elias alone with Master Teller, whose penetrating gaze now focused solely on him. The man's scrutiny was thorough, but not unkind, evaluative rather than judgmental. "So," he said finally, his voice deep and measured, "you're the boy who shared his soup with a king." Elias blinked in surprise. "You know about that?" A hint of amusement flickered across Master Teller's austere features. His Majesty's message was quite detailed regarding the circumstances of your appointment. Unusual but not unprecedented. The Academy has welcomed students from diverse backgrounds throughout its history. He gestured for Elias to follow him. "Come, we have much to cover before you can be properly integrated into Academy life." They moved through the entrance hall toward a corridor that branched off to the right, Master Teller setting a brisk pace that Elias hurried to match. As they walked, the academic continued speaking, his tone matter-of-fact. "The Royal Academy operates on principles of merit and service. Your background, whether noble or common, wealthy or impoverished, matters less than your capacity for growth, your dedication to learning, and your commitment to using your education for the benefit of Westerland." He glanced at Elias. "Do you understand what that means?" Elias considered carefully before answering. "That I'm here to learn how to be useful. To the kingdom, I mean." Master Teller nodded, seeming satisfied with the response. "Precisely. Not just useful, but optimally useful, developing whatever innate talents you possess to their highest potential." He paused before a door, turning to face Elias directly. "It won't be easy. You'll need to work harder than you've ever worked, study subjects you've never encountered, adapt to structures and expectations entirely foreign to your experience thus far." His gaze sharpened. "Are you prepared for that challenge?" The question wasn't rhetorical. Master Teller was genuinely asking if Elias understood what lay ahead, if he was committed to the difficult path of transformation that awaited him. It was, Elias realized, the first time since boarding the royal ship that anyone had implicitly acknowledged he had a choice. "Yes, sir," he answered with quiet conviction. "I'm prepared to try. I can't promise I'll succeed at everything, but I can promise I'll give my best effort." For the first time, Master Teller smiled, a brief expression that nonetheless transformed his severe countenance into something almost warm. Honesty and realistic self-assessment, good foundations to build upon. He opened the door, revealing a small office lined with books and dominated by a desk covered in neat stacks of papers. "Now let's begin the process of determining exactly where you stand academically, so we can chart an appropriate course of study." What followed was the most comprehensive evaluation Elias had ever experienced. A series of questions, exercises, and discussions that probed not just his knowledge, limited in formal terms but surprisingly broad in practical areas, but his reasoning abilities, his learning style, his interests and aptitudes. Master Teller neither praised nor criticized, simply noted Elias's responses with occasional comments in a leather-bound notebook. By the time they finished, afternoon had given way to early evening, shadows lengthening across the office floor. Elias's head buzzed with the effort of concentrated thinking after so many years of focusing primarily on physical survival. He felt simultaneously drained and exhilarated, challenged in ways that awakened something long dormant within him. Master Teller closed his notebook with a decisive motion. "Well, Elias of Meridian Bay, you present an interesting case. Your formal education is, unsurprisingly, fragmented. Strong in some areas, entirely absent in others. However, your analytical abilities are remarkably developed, likely a consequence of the independence you've maintained these past years." He tapped the notebook thoughtfully. "We'll need to design a specialized curriculum to address the gaps while building on your strengths. It will mean additional work, particularly in the beginning." "I understand, sir," Elias replied, undaunted by the prospect. Hard work was hardly a new concept. "Good." Master Teller rose from behind his desk. "Now let's address practical matters. You'll need a proper uniform, personal supplies, and orientation to academy routines. And I expect you're hungry after our lengthy session." As if summoned by the mention of food, Elias's stomach growled audibly, causing a flush of embarrassment to heat his cheeks. Master Teller's expression softened marginally. A reasonable response after such exertion. "Come, the dining hall should be serving the evening meal by now. We'll continue our orientation there." They left the office and traversed a series of corridors, eventually emerging into a large, high-ceilinged room where long tables were arranged in neat rows. Students of various ages sat grouped together, their blue and silver uniforms creating a visual harmony despite the diversity of their appearances. The noise level was moderate, conversation rather than chaos, the atmosphere one of ordered conviviality. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. Heads turned, conversation faltered. Curious eyes tracked their progress as Master Teller led Elias toward a table where several adults in academic robes were seated. "Colleagues," Master Teller addressed them, "may I present Elias of Meridian Bay, newly appointed to the Academy by direct commission of His Majesty. Elias, these are some of the instructors who will guide your education. Mistress Lyda, Languages and Diplomacy; Master Corwin, Sciences and Mathematics; Mistress Neva, History and Governance; and Master Phelan, Physical Training and Defense." The instructors greeted Elias with varying degrees of curiosity and reserve. Mistress Lyda, a petite woman with warm brown skin and quick, intelligent eyes, smiled encouragingly. "Welcome to the Academy, Elias. We're always pleased to receive new students, especially those who arrive with such interesting stories." "Stories?" Elias echoed, uncertain. "Word travels quickly in royal circles," Master Corwin explained, his tone dry but not unkind. "It's not every day that a king discovers a worthy candidate for the Academy while disguised as a beggar. Quite dramatic, really." Elias felt his face heat with embarrassment. "I didn't know he was the king," he said defensively. "I just thought he was hungry." Which is precisely what makes the story meaningful. Mistress Neva interjected, her silver-streaked dark hair framing a face lined with experience. "Kindness offered without expectation of return or recognition reveals true character." "Indeed," Master Teller agreed. "And speaking of hunger, I believe Elias would benefit from sustenance after our lengthy evaluation. Perhaps one of our current students could assist in orienting him to dining hall protocols, while I confer with you regarding his academic placement." Mistress Lyda beckoned to a girl seated at a nearby table, perhaps 13 or 14, with copper-colored hair pulled back in a practical braid and a dusting of freckles across her serious face. "Leona, would you come here, please?" The girl rose immediately, approaching with confident strides. "Yes, Mistress Lyda?" "Leona, this is Elias, newly arrived at the Academy. Would you kindly show him how meals work here and help him feel welcome?" The instructor's tone made the request sound more like an expectation than a question. Leona studied Elias with frank curiosity before nodding. "Of course, mistress. Happy to help." She turned to Elias with a smile that transformed her serious expression into something warmer. "Come on, new boy. Let's get you fed before everything good is gone." With a glance at Master Teller, who nodded permission, Elias followed Leona toward a table where several students of similar age were seated. His guide maintained a running commentary as they went. "That's the third-year table where you just met the instructors. First years sit there," she pointed to a table occupied by younger children. "Second years there, and so on. We're fourth years, which means we've been here since we were 10 or 11. She gave him a sidelong glance. "How old are you, anyway?" 12, Elias replied, trying to absorb the information while also managing the nervousness that threatened to overwhelm him as they approached the table of strangers. "Perfect, you'll be with us then. We lost 2 to early advancement last term, so there's room." They reached the table, where conversation paused as the occupants regarded the newcomer with interest. "Everyone, this is Elias. He's new." "Elias, this is everyone." The casual introduction broke the momentary tension. The students shifted to make room, questions and introductions flowing freely as Leona guided Elias through the mechanics of academy dining, where to collect a plate, how servings worked, the expectations for behavior during meals. "You came with Master Teller," one boy noted as they ate. "That means you're special entry, right? Not regular admission?" Elias hesitated, unsure how to respond without seeming to boast or lie. Leona came to his rescue. "Stop being nosy, Dabby. Special entry, regular admission. It doesn't matter once you're here. Everyone has to do the same work, meet the same standards." "I'm just curious," Davy protested. "The only special entries I've seen were noble kids whose parents had connections." "Well, I'm not noble," Elias said firmly. "I'm an orphan from Meridian Bay. I was living on my own until..." He paused, still uncertain how much of his story had spread, how much he should share. "Until you gave food to a disguised king who recognized your inherent goodness and offered you a place at the academy?" Another girl supplied, her expression caught between skepticism and fascination. "That's the story going around anyway." Elias blinked in surprise. "How does everyone already know about that?" The table erupted in laughter. "Palace gossip moves faster than light," Leona explained. "By tomorrow, they'll be saying you saved the king from assassins or performed miraculous healings." "It wasn't like that at all," Elias protested. "I just shared some soup, fish scraps, and old vegetables. It wasn't even good soup." Something in his earnest denial seemed to endear him to the group. The initial wariness faded, replaced by genuine curiosity about his life before the academy, his journey to the capital, his first impressions of their school. Elias found himself answering their questions with increasing confidence, his nerves gradually settling as the conversation flowed naturally. These children were different from him in many ways. Educated, secure, accustomed to structure and community. But they were also just children, with the same fundamental curiosity, energy, and capacity for acceptance that transcended background. By the time the meal concluded, Elias felt less like an interloper and more like what he was rapidly becoming, a student among students, finding his place in a new world. After dinner, Leona was assigned to show Elias to the fourth-year dormitory and help him settle in. The sleeping quarters were simple but comfortable. 2 rows of narrow beds with storage chests, desks, and small wardrobes, providing each student with a modicum of personal space within the communal setting. "That one's yours." Leona indicated a bed near the middle of the room. "They've already delivered your uniforms and basic supplies. Anything else you need, just ask one of us or an instructor." Elias approached the indicated space, noting the neatly folded blue and silver uniforms atop the bed, the stack of books and writing materials on the desk, the basic toiletries arranged on the small shelf beside the wardrobe. After years of scrounging for essentials, the sudden abundance of new, clean, purpose-specific items was almost overwhelming. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" Leona's voice was gentler than before, her observation unexpectedly perceptive. "When I first came here, I couldn't sleep for days. Too many people, too many new things, too many rules to remember." Elias looked at her with new interest. "Were you, like me, before, I mean?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. My parents are alive, but they're diplomatic couriers, always traveling. I grew up in a succession of temporary lodgings in other people's homes. When I showed aptitude in languages, someone recommended me for the academy." She shrugged. "It was strange at first, but now it feels more like home than anywhere else I've been." The simple confidence in her statement offered Elias unexpected reassurance. If Leona had found belonging here, perhaps he could too. "Thanks," he said suddenly, "for helping me today, for not making me feel like an outsider." Leona smiled, the expression warming her serious features. "We were all new once. Besides, anyone who shares their last bit of food with a stranger is someone worth knowing, king in disguise or not." She gestured to the uniforms. "Get some rest. Morning comes early here and tomorrow you start classes. It's going to be a challenge, but..." She hesitated, then added with surprising earnestness, "You'll be fine, Elias of Meridian Bay. You've already proven you've got what matters most." What's that?" he asked. "A good heart," she replied simply. "The rest, knowledge, skills, protocols, that can all be taught. But decency, kindness when it costs you something, that comes from within." With a casual wave, she headed toward the girls' dormitory. "See you at breakfast." "Don't be late." Alone amid the gradually arriving fourth years, who regarded him with curious but not unfriendly glances, Elias began unpacking his meager possessions. He placed his parents' photograph on the small shelf beside his bed, tucked his book of fables into the drawer of his desk, and carefully stored the gold coin in a small wooden box provided for personal valuables. As he smoothed his hand over the neatly folded uniforms, more new clothing than he'd had in years, the enormity of the change in his circumstances struck him anew. Yesterday morning, he had awakened cold and hungry in an abandoned storefront, his day shaped by the relentless demands of basic survival. Tonight, he lay in a proper bed in the Royal Academy, surrounded by evidence of a future opening before him like an unexpected doorway. All because he had shared a simple meal with a stranger in need. All because, despite years of hardship that might reasonably have hardened his heart against others' suffering, he had chosen kindness instead. As sleep began to claim him, Elias's hand drifted to the shelf where the photograph of his parents stood. They would be proud, he thought drowsily, not of the opportunity or the royal connection, but of the choice he had made on that windswept beach. The choice to see another's hunger as more important than his own caution. The choice that had, against all odds, led him here. In the morning, he would begin learning how to navigate this new world of knowledge and possibility. For now, however, Elias allowed himself to simply rest in the warmth of belonging, in the promise of tomorrow, and in the unexpected truth that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change everything. The years that followed transformed Elias in ways both visible and profound. The half-starved, wary street child gave way to a thoughtful young man whose quiet strength and uncommon empathy earned him respect from peers and instructors alike. The academic gaps that had initially placed him behind his classmates closed through diligent effort and the discovery that his mind, when properly nourished, was remarkably quick and adaptable. Physical transformation accompanied the intellectual. Regular meals, proper rest, and Master Phelan's rigorous training regimen added inches to his height and healthy weight to his once gaunt frame. His movements, which had been quick but furtive, the motions of someone accustomed to avoiding notice, became confident and deliberate. Even his features changed, childish angles maturing into a face that carried echoes of the boy he had been while revealing the man he was becoming. But perhaps the most significant changes occurred in less tangible realms. Elias, who had survived for years by trusting no one but himself, learned to form bonds of friendship and loyalty. He discovered the satisfaction of collective achievement, the comfort of shared burdens, the joy of belonging to something larger than his individual existence. Leona became his closest friend, her straightforward nature and quick intelligence complementing his more reflective approach. Where he was careful, she was bold. Where he was patient, she was decisive. Together, they navigated the Academy's challenges, each making the other stronger through their differences. King Alaric kept his promise to monitor Elias's progress, arranging periodic meetings that evolved from formal check-ins to genuine conversations as the years passed. The king never treated these encounters as charity bestowed upon a former street child, but rather as investments in a promising young citizen of his realm. He questioned, challenged, occasionally advised, but always with the underlying message that Elias's achievements were his own, earned through effort rather than granted through royal favor. By the time Elias reached his 17th year, he had become one of the Academy's exemplary students, not the most brilliant in pure academic terms, but among the most balanced in the combination of intellectual capacity, physical capability, and what Master Teller called applied wisdom. This last quality, the instructors agreed, was where Elias truly excelled. The ability to connect knowledge with practical application, to see not just what was being taught, but why it mattered and how it could serve the greater good. It was this quality, perhaps, that led to his selection for a particularly significant opportunity in the spring of his 17th year. Master Teller summoned him to his office one afternoon, his expression characteristically neutral, but with an underlying current of what Elias had learned to recognize as satisfaction. "You've been chosen," the academic announced without preamble, "to serve on the royal delegation to the Coastal Alliance negotiations next month." Elias blinked in surprise. The Coastal Alliance, a proposed partnership between Westerland and the neighboring coastal kingdoms, had been under discussion for years, its potential to reshape regional trade and security making it one of the most significant diplomatic initiatives of King Alaric's reign. "Me?" he asked, uncharacteristically inarticulate. "But I'm still a student." Master Teller's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "The Academy doesn't exist to keep knowledge safely confined within these walls, Elias. It exists to prepare minds and characters for service. This is an opportunity to apply what you've learned in a context that matters." "But why me specifically?" Elias pressed, genuinely confused. "There are others with stronger diplomatic training, better language skills." "Indeed there are," Master Teller agreed, "and several of them will also be part of the delegation. Your inclusion serves a different purpose." He studied Elias with his penetrating gaze. "The Coastal Alliance negotiations include representatives from all participating regions, including Meridian Bay." Elias finished, understanding dawning. "You want me because I know the area, the people." "Precisely. Your background gives you insights that those raised in the capital might lack. Additionally," Master Teller paused, seemingly weighing his next words, "His Majesty specifically requested your inclusion. He believes your personal journey from Meridian Bay to the Academy exemplifies exactly the kind of transformation the Alliance hopes to inspire in our coastal communities. Growth through opportunity, strength through connection." Elias absorbed this information slowly, emotions conflicting within him. Pride at the recognition, certainly. Excitement at the chance to contribute meaningfully to something that would benefit his hometown. But also, unexpectedly, a twinge of apprehension at the thought of returning to Meridian Bay as someone so different from the boy who had left it 5 years earlier. "The delegation departs in 3 weeks," Master Teller continued, evidently taking Elias's silence for acceptance. "You'll be excused from regular classes to participate in briefings and preparations. Mistress Lyda will oversee your role specifically." He fixed Elias with a significant look. "This is an honor, but also a test. Your first real opportunity to demonstrate the value of the investment made in you. I understand, sir, Elias replied, straightening reflexively. I won't disappoint you. Or His Majesty. Master Teller's expression softened marginally. I've never doubted that, Elias. From your first day here, you've approached every challenge with the same determination that kept you alive on those streets. This is simply a larger arena for that same strength of character. The weeks of preparation passed in a blur of focused activity. Elias immersed himself in briefing documents about the Coastal Alliance, memorizing key points, understanding the complex interplay of interests and concerns that had both driven and delayed the negotiations. Mistress Lyda coached him on diplomatic protocols, helping him refine his natural empathy into a tool for building consensus across different perspectives. Your greatest asset, she told him during one such session, is your authenticity. You aren't pretending to understand the concerns of coastal communities. You've lived them. Don't lose that genuine connection in an attempt to sound more formally diplomatic. Through it all, Elias found himself increasingly drawn to the substance of the alliance itself. The proposal would bring significant infrastructure improvements to coastal towns like Meridian Bay, better harbor facilities, improved roads connecting to inland markets, standardized regulations that would make trade more predictable and profitable. But beyond the material benefits, it promised something less tangible, but perhaps more valuable. Recognition that these communities weren't merely remote outposts of the kingdom, but integral components of its strength and identity. When the day of departure finally arrived, Elias found himself aboard a royal ship once more, the same vessel that had carried him from Meridian Bay 5 years earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on him as he stood at the rail, watching the capital recede behind them. That journey had carried him from hardship to opportunity. This one would test how well he had used that opportunity, how effectively he had transformed potential into capability. The royal delegation was substantial. Nearly 30 people, including the king himself, several high-ranking ministers, diplomatic staff, and a small contingent of academy representatives. Elias, as the junior-most member, initially kept to the background, observing the interactions of more experienced officials and absorbing the dynamics of the group. To his surprise, King Alaric sought him out on the second day of the voyage, inviting him to walk the deck while the others were engaged in a planning session from which Elias had been excused. You seem thoughtful, the king observed as they paced the length of the vessel. Concerned about returning to Meridian Bay? Elias smiled faintly, no longer surprised by the monarch's perceptiveness. Yes, your majesty. It feels strange, like revisiting a dream, or perhaps waking from one. Understandable. Few journeys are as dramatic as yours has been. The king gazed out over the water, his expression reflective. Do you know why I really wanted you on this delegation, Elias? Master Teller said it was because my story exemplifies the transformation the Alliance hopes to inspire. That's the official reason, yes. But there's another. King Alaric turned to face him directly. I wanted you here because you remind me why any of this matters. Politics, diplomacy, alliances, they can become abstract exercises, disconnected from the lives they're meant to improve. You are my connection to reality, to the human impact of governance. The responsibility implicit in those words settled on Elias's shoulders, weighty but not unwelcome. I'll try to be worthy of that role, your majesty. You already are, the king replied simply, just as you were worthy when you shared your soup with a stranger. Everything since, your education, your growth, has merely given shape and direction to the character that was already there. They completed their circuit of the deck in companionable silence, each absorbed in private thoughts as the ship carried them steadily toward Meridian Bay and whatever awaited them there. The town came into view on the morning of the fourth day, a collection of buildings clustered around its natural harbor, so much smaller than Elias remembered, yet instantly, achingly familiar. Emotion tightened his throat as details emerged with their approach. The weathered docks where he had scavenged for fish scraps, the market square where he had searched for dropped coins, the cliff path along which he had guided a disguised king. Places that had once defined the boundaries of his existence now appeared as mere components of a landscape he had outgrown. The royal vessel's arrival caused predictable excitement. Boats put out from the harbor to escort them in, flags and banners appeared on buildings, people gathered along the waterfront to witness the spectacle. Elias, standing with the rest of the delegation on the deck, scanned the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, wondering if he would recognize anyone, if anyone would recognize him. As they disembarked to formal greetings from town officials, Elias remained in the background, his academy uniform marking him as part of the delegation, but his youth placing him lower in the hierarchy. The formalities proceeded according to protocol. Speeches of welcome, introductions of key participants, an honor guard escorting the king and senior officials to the town hall where the negotiations would take place. Elias followed with the junior members of the delegation, acutely aware of curious glances from townspeople. Did they see any trace of the half-starved boy who had haunted their margins? Or was his transformation complete enough to render him unrecognizable, just another uniformed representative of the distant capital? The answer came unexpectedly as they passed the town's small fish market. A grizzled man looked up from the stall he was arranging, his weathered face freezing in an expression of disbelief as his gaze locked on Elias. Marco, the fishmonger who had sometimes slipped him extra scraps, who had called him Little Ghost. For a moment, Elias feared the man might call out, might draw attention to his past in ways that could embarrass the delegation or undermine his role. Instead, Marco simply stared, then slowly raised his hand in a gesture of recognition. Not a wave or a greeting, but an acknowledgement of a journey witnessed, a transformation respected. Elias returned the gesture, a silent exchange that bridged his past and present without diminishing either. Something tight in his chest loosened. Perhaps returning to Meridian Bay wouldn't be as disorienting as he had feared. Perhaps it was possible to honor where he had come from while embracing who he had become. The negotiations began that afternoon in the town hall, a building Elias had only seen from the outside during his years in Meridian Bay, its interior unexplored territory. Representatives from coastal communities throughout Westerland and the neighboring kingdoms gathered around a massive table, with King Alaric presiding from its head. Additional chairs lined the walls for advisors and junior delegates, including Elias. The initial discussions were formal and somewhat stilted, each representative careful to articulate their community's concerns while maintaining diplomatic courtesy. Elias listened intently, noting how issues he had experienced firsthand, seasonal food scarcity, vulnerability to storms, isolation during winter months, were discussed in abstract terms that sometimes missed their human impact. During a brief recess, Mistress Lyda approached him. "You've been quiet," she observed. "Any insights to share when we reconvene?" Elias hesitated. The harbor improvements they're discussing, they're focusing on accommodating larger trading vessels, which makes sense economically. But for local fishermen like Marco, what matters more is protection from winter storms. They lose boats every year because the current seawall isn't sufficient. Mistress Lyda nodded thoughtfully. An important perspective. Perhaps you should share it when appropriate. The opportunity came later that afternoon, when the discussion turned specifically to harbor infrastructure. A debate had emerged between representatives favoring deeper channels for larger ships versus those arguing for expanded dock facilities. When a momentary lull occurred, Mistress Lyda caught the king's eye and gestured subtly toward Elias. King Alaric nodded almost imperceptibly. "I believe one of our academy representatives has relevant insights on this matter. Elias of Meridian Bay, would you share your thoughts?" A ripple of surprise passed through the assembly, partly at the inclusion of such a young voice, partly at the identification of this uniformed representative with their town. Elias rose, fighting the nervousness that threatened to close his throat. "Thank you, Your Majesty." He turned to address the gathered officials, drawing on his training to keep his voice steady and clear. The proposals for deeper channels and expanded docks both have merit for commercial development. However, having lived in Meridian Bay, I've witnessed firsthand how local fishing operations, which are the lifeblood of coastal communities, suffer disproportionately during winter storms due to inadequate seawall protection. He proceeded to outline what he had observed during his years on the streets, the specific areas where storm surge damaged boats, the weeks of lost income when equipment was destroyed, the ripple effects through the community when the fishing fleet couldn't operate. He spoke not from briefing documents but from lived experience, his words carrying the weight of authentic understanding. If the Alliance truly aims to strengthen coastal communities, he concluded, protecting existing livelihoods must be as high a priority as developing new commercial opportunities. An improved seawall benefits everyone, local fishermen immediately, and larger commercial interests in the long term through more stable local economies. When he finished, a moment of silence fell across the hall. Then, to Elias's surprise, the representative from Meridian Bay, a middle-aged woman he vaguely recognized as a town council member, leaned forward. "The young man speaks truth," she said, her voice carrying clearly. We've lost 17 fishing boats to storms in the past decade. Each represents not just property but livelihoods. Families pushed to the edge. She looked directly at Elias. Though I confess, I'm curious how an Academy representative came by such detailed knowledge of our local challenges. Before Elias could respond, King Alaric intervened smoothly. Elias's insights come from personal experience, Counselor Merrick. Before joining the Academy, he was a resident of your town, one whose circumstances gave him a unique perspective on its vulnerabilities and strengths. Understanding dawned on the counselor's face, followed by an expression Elias couldn't quite interpret. Recognition, perhaps, or possibly regret. "I see," she said quietly. "Then we are doubly fortunate to have his voice in these proceedings." The discussion shifted after that, incorporating Elias's perspective into a more balanced approach to harbor improvements. When the session adjourned for the day, several representatives approached him, seeking additional insights on local conditions and community needs. To his surprise, Elias found himself navigating these conversations with growing confidence. His academy training and personal experience merging into a perspective uniquely valuable to the negotiations. That evening, a formal dinner was held for the delegation and local officials. Elias, seated among the academy representatives, found himself the object of curious attention from townspeople who were gradually connecting him to the half-remembered street child who had haunted their periphery years before. During a lull in the meal, Counselor Merrick approached his table. "Might I have a word, young man?" she asked, her expression serious but not unfriendly. Elias excused himself and followed her to a quieter corner of the room, uncertain what to expect. "I remember you," she said without preamble. Not clearly, but enough to be ashamed that a child lived rough in our town without proper intervention. That reflects poorly on our community, on me personally as a council member. I was very good at avoiding notice. Elias offered, uncomfortable with her self-recrimination, and I actively avoided official attention. Nevertheless, she shook her head. Systems should exist to catch those who fall through the cracks, even when they're trying to hide in those cracks. She studied him with frank assessment. "You've done well for yourself, clearly. The academy suits you." "I've been fortunate," Elias acknowledged. "Not everyone gets the chance I was given." "No, they don't." Counselor Merrick's expression turned thoughtful, which is precisely why this alliance matters. It's not just about trade routes and harbor depths. It's about creating structures that lift people up rather than leaving them to fend for themselves. She smiled suddenly, the expression warming her severe features. "Your contribution today was valuable, Elias of Meridian Bay. I hope it won't be your last." The interaction left Elias contemplative as he rejoined the dinner. His past and present were colliding in unexpected ways, creating something new in the process. Not erasing where he had come from, but transforming it into a source of strength rather than shame. Later that night, unable to sleep in the comfortable quarters assigned to junior delegation members, Elias slipped out to walk the familiar streets of his former home. The town was quiet, most windows dark, the occasional lamplight casting pools of warm illumination on the cobblestones. He moved through the shadows with the instinctive stealth acquired during his years of survival, though now it was habit rather than necessity. His feet carried him inevitably toward the abandoned storefront that had been his shelter, the place he had called home for 3 years before King Alaric's appearance changed everything. He approached cautiously, unsure what he hoped to find, what closure he sought from revisiting this chapter of his past. The building was no longer abandoned. Light glowed faintly from within, and a freshly painted sign hung beside the door. Meridian Bay Youth Shelter. Through the window, Elias could see a common room with simple but comfortable furnishings, several sleeping pallets arranged against the walls, a small kitchen area where his own nest of blankets had once been. "Opened last winter," a voice said behind him, causing Elias to start and turn quickly. Marco the fishmonger stood a few paces away, his weathered face half illuminated by distant lamplight. "After that business with the king and the street boy, word spread, got people thinking about the gaps in our community, the ones that let a child fend for himself for years without help." He gestured toward the shelter. "Town council funded this. Not perfect, but better than nothing." Elias stared at the building, emotion tightening his throat. His hardship had led to something positive, a place where other children in similar circumstances might find safety and support, rather than facing the bitter lessons of solitary survival. "I knew it was you the moment I saw you with that royal bunch," Marco continued. "Different on the outside, taller, stronger, dressed fancy. But the eyes don't change. Still the same, watching everything, missing nothing." He scratched his beard thoughtfully. You did all right for yourself, little ghost. I had help, Elias said quietly. Someone saw value in me when I didn't see it myself. Marco nodded. That king of yours, cleverer than he looks, disguising himself to see how things really stand. He fixed Elias with a penetrating look. You tell him something for me next time you're alone with him. Tell him Marco says the real test of a kingdom isn't how it treats its powerful, but how it makes sure no one falls through the gaps. Even clever little ghosts who think they can survive on their own. I'll tell him, Elias promised, recognizing the wisdom in the fishmonger's rough-spoken philosophy. Marco grunted in acknowledgement, then added gruffly, Good to see you whole, boy. You make something of yourself with this chance you got. Make it count for more than just you. With that, he turned and shuffled away, leaving Elias standing before the transformed shelter, a physical manifestation of how hardship could, with proper attention and care, be converted into opportunity for others. It struck him as a fitting metaphor for his own journey and for the larger purpose of the Coastal Alliance itself. The remaining days of negotiations unfolded with increasing momentum. Elias found himself drawn more actively into the proceedings, his unique perspective valued by representatives from both the royal delegation and the coastal communities. What had begun as a token inclusion became a meaningful contribution, his voice helping to bridge gaps in understanding between capital and periphery, between political theory and lived reality. On the final day, as the alliance document was prepared for formal signing, King Alaric requested Elias's presence in a private meeting. They sat in the small study adjoining the town hall's main chamber, the sounds of preparation filtering through the closed door. You've exceeded expectations, the king said without preamble. Your contributions to these negotiations have been substantive and meaningful. Thank you, Your Majesty. Elias inclined his head, accepting the praise while still somewhat uncomfortable with it. I've simply tried to represent accurately what I've experienced and observed, which is precisely why your input has been valuable. Too often, governance becomes an abstraction, policies and regulations disconnected from the lives they impact. The king leaned forward, his expression earnest. You've helped keep these negotiations grounded in reality, Elias. It's a rare gift, and one I hope you'll continue to develop. I'm not sure I understand, Your Majesty. King Alaric smiled slightly. You're approaching completion of your academy training. Soon you'll need to choose a path of service to the realm. I had assumed, given your aptitudes, you might be drawn to diplomatic or administrative roles in the capital. But watching you here, seeing how effectively you bridge worlds, he paused thoughtfully. Perhaps there's another possibility worth considering. Elias waited, curious about the direction of the king's thoughts. The Coastal Alliance will require ongoing attention, not just implementation of its provisions, but continuous assessment of its impacts, adjustments to address unforeseen consequences. King Alaric gestured toward the window, beyond which lay the town and harbor. What if you were to serve as a liaison between the coastal communities and the capital? Someone who understands both worlds, who can translate between them, ensuring that policies serve their intended purpose rather than becoming empty gestures? The proposal caught Elias by surprise. He had indeed been considering his post-academy path, assuming it would lead to the capital and its institutions. The idea of a role that would keep him connected to communities like Meridian Bay, that would allow him to address directly the kinds of challenges he had once faced personally, stirred something deep within him. It would mean travel, the king continued. Regular visits to coastal towns throughout Westerland, periodic returns to the capital for reporting and consultation. Less stability than a court position, perhaps, but more direct impact. I'm honored by the suggestion, Your Majesty, Elias said slowly, mind racing with possibilities. And ... intrigued. It feels like a natural extension of the path that began when you found me on that beach. King Alaric's expression warmed. I had the same thought. There's a pleasing symmetry to it, isn't there? The boy who shared his meal becoming the man who helps ensure no child goes hungry in his kingdom. Put that way, the role seemed not just appealing, but somehow inevitable. The culmination of a journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a windswept beach. A chance to transform his personal experience of hardship into a force for positive change on a scale he could never have imagined as that hungry, solitary child. I would be honored to serve in such a capacity, Your Majesty, Elias said with quiet conviction. To help ensure that the alliance truly benefits those it's meant to serve. Excellent. The king rose, signaling the end of their private conversation. We'll discuss specifics when we return to the capital. For now, there's an alliance to formalize. The signing ceremony that followed was both solemn and celebratory, representatives from all participating communities affixing their signatures to the document that would reshape the region's future. As a junior member of the delegation, Elias had no formal role in the proceedings, yet he felt profoundly connected to what was unfolding. This wasn't abstract policy, but the foundation for real change in communities like the one that had shaped him. When the ceremony concluded and the formal celebrations began, Elias found a quiet moment to slip away to the beach, the same stretch of sand where 5 years earlier he had shared his meager meal with a disguised king. The day was warmer than that long-ago winter afternoon, the sea calmer, but the essential character of the place remained unchanged. The rhythm of waves against shore, the cry of gulls overhead, the vast horizon promising worlds beyond immediate view. He made his way to the outcropping of rocks where he had once built his small fire and cooked his soup of fish scraps. Sitting on the same flat stone where King Alaric, then just Thomas, to him, had rested, Elias gazed out at the endless sea and considered the extraordinary journey that had brought him from desperate survival to meaningful purpose. One meal shared with a stranger, one act of kindness given without expectation of return. Such a small thing to have altered the course of a life so dramatically. But perhaps that was the point, that seemingly small actions, undertaken with genuine compassion, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. His sharing of soup had led to personal transformation through opportunity and education. That transformation had positioned him to contribute to the Coastal Alliance. The alliance would improve conditions in communities throughout the region, potentially changing countless lives for the better. All from one meal shared, one moment of seeing another's need as worthy of response despite his own scarcity. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and crimson, Elias reached into his pocket and withdrew the coin King Alaric had given him that day. The gold ducat he had carried ever since as a tangible reminder of how life could change in an instant. He turned it in his fingers, watching how it caught the fading light, how the king's profile seemed to shift with each movement. "You kept it," a voice observed from behind him. Elias turned to find King Alaric approaching along the beach, having evidently followed him from the celebrations. He rose quickly, offering a bow of respect. "Of course, Your Majesty. You said to keep it as a reminder." The king joined him on the outcropping, gazing out at the same view Elias had been contemplating. "Do you remember what else I said that day?" Elias thought back, the memory crystal clear despite the passage of years. That kindness, especially from those who have little to give, has immeasurable worth. "Indeed." King Alaric nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "A truth I was reminded of when a half-starved boy offered soup to a stranger." He turned to face Elias directly. "That boy has grown into a remarkable young man, one who continues to demonstrate the same essential character that caught my attention 5 years ago. I've had exceptional opportunities." Elias said, uncomfortable with praise that seemed to attribute too much to his own merit. "Without the academy, without your intervention, without those things, you would still have been Elias." The king interrupted gently. "Different circumstances might have shaped your path differently, but the core of who you are, the part that chose to share that meal despite your own hunger, that would have remained." The assertion gave Elias pause. He had often wondered who he might have become without the king's intervention, whether the daily struggle for survival would eventually have hardened him, turned compassion into something he could no longer afford. "The academy didn't create your character, Elias," King Alaric continued, seeming to read his thoughts. "It simply gave it room to flourish, tools to express itself effectively. The kindness was always yours, the choice to share, to see beyond your own need that was already within you." The perspective shifted something in Elias's understanding of his own journey. Perhaps his transformation hadn't been as complete as he had imagined. Perhaps the well-educated young man in an academy uniform wasn't a replacement for the street child, but rather a fuller expression of who that child had always had the potential to become. "In the years ahead," the king said, turning back to gaze at the darkening sea, "as you undertake this new role we've discussed, remember this beach and what happened here. Remember that seemingly small acts of compassion can change lives in ways we can never anticipate. And remember that sometimes the greatest service we can offer is simply to see another's humanity when circumstances have rendered it invisible to others." "I will, Your Majesty," Elias promised, the words feeling like a renewal of the commitment he had made when accepting his place at the academy 5 years earlier. They stood in companionable silence as the sun completed its descent, darkness gradually claiming the beach. Behind them, lights from the town created a warm glow against the gathering night. A community preparing to move into a future shaped, in some small way, by a meal once shared between an orphan and a king in disguise. When they finally turned to walk back toward town, Elias carefully returned the gold coin to his pocket. He no longer needed it as a physical reminder of how life could transform through unexpected kindness. That lesson was now woven into the fabric of his being, into the purpose that would guide his days ahead. But he would keep it nonetheless. A tangible connection to the moment when hunger met compassion, when scarcity yielded to sharing, when a simple human connection opened a door to possibilities previously unimagined. One meal shared, one life transformed, and through that transformation, the promise of many more lives touched, many more hungers addressed, many more invisible humanities recognized and honored. It had begun with soup made from fish scraps and old vegetables, offered to a stranger on a windswept beach. It would continue in ways Elias couldn't yet envision, but embraced with quiet certainty. The ongoing ripples of that single act of kindness, expanding outward into a future full of possibility.